Today's episode on military aviation history is sponsored by the Great Courses Plus. Hello everyone and welcome back to Military Aviation History. I'm your host Bismarck and today I want to talk about why the B-17 failed in part of its intended role. Now, before we misunderstand each other, know that I'm of course not talking about the aircraft's role as a strategic bomber. As a long-range strategic tool, the B-17 was exactly what the United States and the Allies needed to conduct their daytime bomber offensive during the Second World War, notably of course against Italy, Germany and also Japan. It was a tough aircraft, had good range and a respectable bomb load, exactly what you needed. However, although the B-17 saw tremendous success in this role, when it was being developed, many had anticipated to also use it for quite a different purpose. So to answer this, we need to travel back in time into the interwar years, because the groundwork of the B-17 was of course laid there. The United States Army Air Force did not even exist as such. Instead, its spiritual father, the Army Air Corps, was laying the groundwork, the foundation, out of which the later service would then finally emerge. The 1920s and 1930s were an awkward time in the United States when it came to all things flying. Coming out of World War I, the US had yet to catch up with fellow nations such as Britain and specifically, in fact, France, who was leading the aeronautical community when it came to those magnificent flying machines. True enough, a large portion of the US aviators had been trained in cooperation with the French, and many of their aircraft were in fact Français. The US had made a tremendous effort to expand their existing air service, but much of it, initially at least, was poorly managed and based on the erroneous assumption that car and aircraft production wasn't all that different. Except for engine production, the domestic aeronautical developments actually took some time to get going, but yeah, going they did eventually. For more information on all of that, see my previous video. During peacetime, the US experienced a vibrant boom in the air industry. Flying, of course, captivated the masses, and as the years went by, commercial enterprises kickstarted the first golden age of flying. In the meantime, the US military apparatus obviously could not ignore the capabilities of an air fleet in any upcoming conflict. While aircraft had indeed not decided the First World War, their potential and their capabilities had been visible for all. There was one problem, and that was the budget. The Air Corps and the Navy developed air fleets independent from each other, which meant that each had to allocate their own resources to the development, the introduction, and of course the maintenance of the aircraft. Due to ongoing rivalry and a very special mixture of spice and fire that was added by yours sincerely Billy Mitchell, neither the Air Corps nor the Navy exhibited much interest in cooperating. Instead, they actively placed boulders in each other's paths and, well, sought to push through their own interests. The Navy, of course, to keep control of an independent air arm, that would be the first line of defense for the United States, and the Air Corps for unifying all things flying under one banner, theirs. That is of course simplifying matters significantly. You can read about it more in some of the sources I use for this video. As always, they are detailed in the description below. Part of the discussion was the question on who should be responsible to defend the United States coastlines. The Navy, by virtue of literally floating on the most likely approach path of an enemy force, that of course being the ocean, saw itself as the very first line of defense. The Navy was the extended arm of Uncle Sam's political will and could, if necessary, be used as a far-reaching fist to defend US interests. It projected power and was, in essence, partly a strategic weapon even, able to hoist the star-spangled banner far beyond the shores of the homeland. Having done so since the Tripolitanian War of 1801 to 1805, it was certainly not going to stop now. In contrast, the Air Corps saw itself as the new up-and-coming force that would play a decisive role in any future conflict. When it came to defending the US, the Air Corps argued that the Navy could be circumvented in a surprise attack, sunk or deployed in the wrong areas. Instead, air power was the solution. By placing a strong air fleet on the shores of the nation, long-range patrols quick and decisive anti-shipping strikes and a concentration of air power would serve the United States far better. Naturally, the Air Corps saw this as a non-Navy task, which should fall squarely into the hands of the Army, and thus air officers, aviators, whom were the only ones that could be trusted to understand aviation. At least that's how the argument went, albeit somewhat simplified. To demonstrate that aircraft would easily overcome any inbound naval strike force, various trials were conducted. You had the first trials in 1921, resulting in a slow and awkward death of the former German battleship Ostfriesland, mirrored by attacks on the pre-dreadnought USS Alabama and 2 years later the USS Virginia and New Jersey. Come the 1930s, Billy Mitchell was no longer a factor, but ongoing struggle over the budget, who controlled what, and who was to be the United States' new point man continued, albeit based on more matter-for-fact discussion in comparisons to Mitchell's later years. An agreement was reached more or less in 1933 between MacArthur and Pratt, and was later revised in the 1935 Joint Action Statement. Actually remember that one because it will be important in just a minute. So why this excursion then into the interwar years when we are talking about a bomber used during the Second World War? Well, this is where we turn to that. Come 1934, and the Air Corps is looking for a replacement to their Martin B-10 bomber. The B-10 had actually only just appeared, but showed a considerable jump in performance. As the first US all-metal monoplane bomber, it was actually faster than even most advanced fighter aircraft the Army had at the time. But as so often, the innovator causing a revolution often sees himself surpassed, and the B-10 had a limited life expectancy. Provided with the specifications then describing the speed, the range and the payload, Boeing came up with a 4-engine bomber design. At this point, the Model 299, as it was known, raised quite some eyes. Not specifically in a good way either. True enough, Boeing had realized that even the most advanced twin-engine design, like those of their competitors for example, had little chance of actually becoming a practical answer to the proposed specification by the War Department. Thus, better needed to be met with bigger, and that's where their design came into play. It held the promise of being exactly what the Air Corps wanted and seemed to trump the opposition. The massive machine, fast long range with a considerable bomb load, made several air officers squirm with anticipation. In their eyes, they finally had that true strategic weapon they were seeking. The only problem was that the Navy was the tool of projection, not the Air Corps, so automatically the strategic element of the weapon made it a bit vulnerable to the interests of those that preferred the whiff of salt water and the tempers of Neptune. There were two additional problems. The first one, Model 299, actually crashed before finishing the evaluation. Second, the cost of the aircraft was actually gargantuan for the time. The twin-engine Douglas B-18 Bolo bomber, based in part under the civilian DC liner, was chosen instead as it, and I quote, satisfied practical requirements at a reasonable cost, end quote. Now, if you'd factor in capability, the B-17 was actually cheaper than the B-18, but that's always going to be a tough sale and, well, beside the point for now. Nevertheless, the insistence of air officers saw a handful of YB-17s, the prototype, as it was known, ordered, and trial flights were flown. Interpreting the aforementioned 1935 Joint Action Statement, I hope you remember it, their way, the air officers saw their role as one of long-range defense, which included, notably, anti-shipping. Building on this loophole, it allowed them to acquire a token number of these 4-engine bombers for experimental purposes. Brigadier General Frank Andrews slotted the heavy bomber into the already existing parameters of the Air Corps. This didn't, at least not officially, foresee the use of the heavy bomber as a strategic weapon the way we think of it nowadays, but be necessary to guarantee actually the success of the Air Corps' mission in safeguarding the US from attack. As he said himself, the long-range heavy bomber could, and I quote, stop hostile air expeditions at their source, end quote. What source is that, you might ask? Perhaps an aerodrome north or south of the border? Or perhaps on Greenland? No. Andrews actually meant aircraft carriers, and the heavy bomber, so the logic at least, was the most flexible weapon to search and destroy these floating airfields. Likewise, a more theoretical application was using the B-17 as a tool of power, a projection of power, as to ensure that both the North and South American countries remained within the sphere of influence of the US. The B-17, mind you, was actually used on so-called goodwill visits to Latin America just for that. You can now see the problem emerging once more. For 120 odd years, Uncle Sam was represented abroad by the magnificent sight of the tall ship and, well, the dreadnought, with cannon, coal and oil. Now suddenly, for a fraction of the price of a lumbering hulk, you could have a squadron of B-17s that could be deployed faster than any fleet ever could. You can see the awkward dynamic there that unfolds between the Navy's very own raison d'etre, their reason to exist, and the upstart Air Corps riding on the merciless tide of technological progress. Nevertheless, come March 1937, the Joint Air Exercise No. 4 actually developed a scenario that both the Navy and the Air Corps took part in. Hunting for the USS Utah, a ship meant to represent an enemy fleet, Air Corps B-17s launched multiple strikes. Long story short, the B-17s eventually found the Utah and, well, they bombed it, scoring 3 hits. As the Utah had been taking evasive action, this was a remarkable result. Although unofficial bombing runs were also done the day after, no records were available for the number of hits scored then. As the story goes, actually, the Navy had the official results of the day before classified, only to have them leaked shortly later. But that didn't stop the Air Corps, because a year later the B-17s were once again part of anti-shipping trials. Enthusiastic about their new aircraft, the aviators planned to land a PR coup designed to make a statement, broadcasting both their desire to stand as an air force and to show off the capabilities of their new bomber fleet, of which they wanted more, lots more. For this, they could have rounded up a fleet and flown over America's big cities with their B-17s in a fearsome display of air power. They did some of that, yeah. They could also have made long-distance flights, going from one part of the country to the other, and showing off the strike potential of the aircraft. And yes, they did some of that too. But those kind of stunts had been done in the past, and while they were still exciting for some, they were nothing new. What the B-17 needed, or specifically what the aviators needed, was something bold, something unheard of, and something that ideally also upset the Navy. So they got together and hatched out a plan that had just that perfect concoction of guts and glory. But before we turn to that, here is a quick note on today's sponsor. The Great Courses Plus is a subscription on-demand video service providing lectures, courses and learning opportunities in a library encompassing over 11,000 video lectures from science, nature to art and history. I myself had a look at some of their lectures on aviation, for example, air power over Germany and air power in theory and practice, getting really envious of the fact that they could afford 2 cameras while I only have 1. I mean, look at that seamless transition, beautiful, smooth. I decided also to look a little bit beyond my horizon. In just over 2 hours I learned that German Riesling is the most efficient wine out there, reacquainted myself with the Battle of Nations of 1813, went on an expedition to the polar regions and finally brushed up on my camera skills to make better videos for all of you. If you want to try the Great Courses Plus, you can do so with a free trial. Visit thegreatcoursesplus.com/military aviation. Signing up with this URL will let them know that I sent you. That supports the channel, and if you like the idea of learning something and at the same time helping out Old Bismarck, click on the link in the description below to start your free trial today. Back then to the aviators of the 1930s. What was their brilliant plan? From today's perspective, well, it was actually simple. Find and intercept an Italian ocean liner coming over to the United States, the SS Rex, back then one of the fastest, most modern commercial liners out there. Back then, this had never been done before, and there was no radar, there was no constant update on the target's position and speed. Instead, math, skill and luck would determine the outcome of this very gamble. On the 12th of May 1938, then 3 B-17s took off to find the Italians. Weather was actually bad, but still manageable, and the crews were given the Rex's last known position, and then the aircraft simply took off towards the anticipated rendezvous point with the ocean liner. On board the B-17 was actually one Lieutenant Curtis LeMay, acting as a navigator. He calculated interception to take place at 12:25 p.m. and LeMay, and this makes the German in me so very happy, he was perfectly accurate. At 23 minutes past the hour, the B-17s broke out of the clouds only to find the Rex right in front of them, and by 25 minutes past the hour, they started to buzz the ocean liner in close formation, 725 miles off New York City. The gamble had paid off handsomely. At no point had aircraft intercepted a ship in such a handsome fashion, far away from the coastlines, in bad weather, and without any outside guidance. For the people on board the ship, well, the flybys at smokestack level were a once-in-a-lifetime experience. Just imagine it. A minute ago, the Rex was sailing smoothly along the waves, and now suddenly, three massive machines, bigger than anything you've seen before, were circling around in a phenomenal display of interwar air power. Upon return, photographs and radio broadcasts went up and down the country, and the coup was perfect. Next to this, hardly anyone took notice on the mock raids on New York City or the first blackout organized in the United States to raise awareness on strategic bombing. That was peanuts at this point. But while the pilots were celebrating, the War Department actually issued an interesting order, limiting further endeavors overseas for the aviators at a limit of 100 miles or later 300 miles from the coastline. The nature of this order makes it a little bit of a he said, she said affair. In any case, it was sometimes blatantly disregarded, as both B-17s and also all the B-10s were actually used to intercept ships such as the Queen of Bermuda and the Republic, as well as flying the 500 miles distance to the French frigate shoals to once again encapsulate that spirit that they had found with the Rex. Indeed, the B-17 was taken by the aviators to be the perfect, the most modern example of how air would be a strategic tool and neutering naval power at any point in time in any given conflict. As Andrews had said, the four-engine bomber was one of the greatest developments in weaponry for coast defense. The B-17, next to its potential strategic role, was seen to be a long-range strike aircraft capable of finding, striking and sinking any incoming naval fleet. Come World War II, it actually saw ample use in this role, which might come as a surprise to some. After all, the Flying Fortress we remember today was one flying up high at 20,000 feet, carpet bombing a whole postcode into submission. Less well known, in fact, is that during the early operation, especially in the Pacific, the B-17s were employed as a dedicated anti-shipping aircraft meant to partake in fleet actions and swing the tide there. True enough, actual land-based targets for the bomber were not that easily found in the area at this point, of course, but the now existent Army Air Force had known of this before. B-17s had been deployed to Hawaii and other bases regardless, meant to strike shipping as much as doing other auxiliary missions like reconnaissance. The Army had anticipated that 9 B-17s targeting a circle of 100-foot radius with a single 2,000-pound bomb each would at least strike one hit on an enemy ship from as high up as 18,000 feet. Considering that many ships presented a larger target, a corresponding increase in hits was assumed. The future looked bright for the B-17, envisioned to sink a whole battle fleet in just one swift blow. Here, theory and perhaps optimistic thinking clouded the judgment of some, but at least there was some evidence to support these claims. Even by 1946, horizontal bombing versus small tugs from 12,000 feet had provided mixed result, which, well, each side of the argument interpreted in their own way. Coming up to 1939, the US slowly geared up its efforts and additional B-17 orders were made with the express use of hemispheric defense rather than any fundamentally established strategic bombing dimension. By extension, the massive four-engine bomber was slotted to safeguard the US-American coastlines. In 1941, when the US was pulled into the war due to the Japanese actions in the Pacific and Southeast Asia, they lost 30 B-17s in one go, wiping out 2/3 of the heavy bomber force available in the region, courtesy of the Japanese actions. The B-17, however, did soon make an appearance. The few aircraft left to the 14th Bombardment Squadrons were used in a desperate defense of the Philippines. While their effect was limited, on the 10th of December 1941, one B-17 pilot became a national hero. Striking Japanese ships off the coast, the media whipped up this tale of him having steered his stricken bomber into the Japanese battleship Haruna, after allowing his crew to bail, of course, and he sunk her apparently in the process of his ram. A single B-17 through bombing and ramming had sunk a mighty battleship, so the story went. Good news or inspiring news was rare those days, so you can see why this got so much traction. In any case, no suicide attack had been made against the Haruna. This battleship would in fact return at Midway. The ship attacked by the pilot was the cruiser Ashigara. No hits were scored and he crashed into the open sea. Nevertheless, the story continued to be sold just like the propaganda of the time, even beyond World War II. Moving on into 1942, one lesser known detail about the Battle of Midway was that B-17s were the first to strike the Japanese on the 3rd of June 1942, just prior to the actual battle. The first strike, breaking up a textbook 9-ship formation into 3 smaller parts, did not actually hit a single Japanese ship, although multiple hits were claimed by the pilots and the crews. All in all, at Midway, 314 bombs were dropped by B-17s, and based on pre-war estimates, at least 20 to 30 hits should have been scored. Although we will never know for sure, it seems that only one destroyer was hit, and not even that hard perhaps, while the B-17s essentially only gave the Japanese sailors on the battleship Haruna, there she is again, a fright, and killed 2 aboard the Magami with a near miss. Meanwhile, they also forced a US Tambor-class submarine, the Grayling, to crash dive after mistaking her, and I don't know how to put this, but yes, they mistook her for a cruiser. Well, true enough, the crews were new, inexperienced, and drafted after 1939. Their ship recognition wasn't the best, and the strategic component of the B-17 was started to be pushed instead of the anti-shipping missions. But in application in 1942 in the Pacific, they still largely operated in a way that Billy Mitchell would actually have wanted. And as an aside, when the aircrews actually returned from Midway with their overall claims of 22 direct hits, they actually had an advantage over the Navy in a way that they got to talk to the press first, with the ironic result that the Battle of Midway was initially reported to having been won by the Air Force. The B-17 was soon seen to be a lost cause for anti-shipping. The amount of planes needed to concentrate bombs in a tight enough cluster to sink a maneuvering ship, the amount of logistical support that was needed, the limited basing options in the Pacific, and the high skill ceiling a bombardier actually needed to reach made the flying fortress impractical in naval actions. Beyond that, the ships during World War II had a lot more air defensive than during the interwar years, and thus made the attacks a lot riskier. They had to be flown at a higher altitude as well, making them even less accurate and so forth. Also, many of the training sorties had actually been done against targets that were moving in a straight line, and when this was criticized, air power advocates usually argued that the difference between a ship going at a constant speed and heading versus one going evasive was negated by the saturation of bombs. Additionally, during the trials and also the interception of the Rex, the approximate position, heading and speed of the target was known. Information that was often not available or provided during the wartime, and if so, often inaccurate. Credit must be given where it is due, and there was some success, of course. The battleship Hei was hit by one bomb dropped by a B-17, and famously the destroyer Mutsuki was actually sunk after the captain refused to get on the way when the heavy bombers appeared on the horizon, saying that, well, they never hit anything before, so they're not going to hit us now. And then he was fished out of the water a few minutes later. But yeah, there you go. Those were isolated incidents, and as the German historian Dr. Roman Töppel, talking about something completely different with me recently, told me, exceptions prove the rule. Again, wartime reality had squashed idealized interwar theory. When it comes down to it, the only effect the B-17s had, and this is something that we should take into account, was that it could force ships into evasive maneuvers, split fleet cohesion, perhaps even interrupt carrier action, and beyond that, report the position of the fleet. But that is a limited role, and other machines could have done it as well. Luckily for the United States, the B-17 was a flexible machine, and it would soon fully embrace the role it became famous for, strategic bombing. I want to quickly go back to the SS Rex as a side excursion here, since you already know the story of the B-17 during World War II. For some reason, reading about her actually made me want to share a little bit about her story. Her maiden voyage was in 1932, when she held space for roughly 2,000 passengers. She displaced 45,000 tons, was 270 meters in length, and achieved a maximum speed in excess of 28 knots, allowing her to hold the blue ribbon until 1935. She continued her commercial role into 1940, when she was being pushed into an auxiliary role for Italy's effort in their own backyard, the Mare Nostrum, or as we know it, the Mediterranean. Until 1943, the ocean liner made some limited supply runs for the Axis in the Mediterranean, mainly as a repurposed hospital ship, in fact. And she was later seized by the Germans in Trieste after Italy surrendered, changed sides, or became embroiled in a civil war. Depends really how you look at it. The ship was largely abandoned and ill-maintained, and when she was moved away from the harbor of Trieste, she hit the shallows and could not be floated again. On the 8th of September 1944, Royal Air Force and South African Air Force, both fighters caught up with her, littered her with cannon and rocket fire, and she partially submerged and continued to burn for 4 days. After that, she was partially scrapped during the Cold War. Remains of her actually can apparently still be found off the coast to this very day. Thank you at this point very much for watching, and I want to thank the Great Courses Plus for sponsoring this episode. Please consider sharing the video, and as always, have a great day, good hunting, and see you in the sky.